Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everybody. So, last time we left off looking at the artwork of the 19th century, but now we will get into the 20th century and move our way up into the contemporary world. So, jumping right on in. So, in the first decades of the 20th century, Western views on natural reality begin to change radically. So, we saw this kind of proliferation of styles or stylistic pluralism in the 19th century, but we're going to start seeing that even more rapidly. And so, we'll start to see people radically challenge a lot of the traditional notions of art, and then they'll begin to challenge those challenges and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the Industrial Revolution, of the 19th or late 18th, early 19th centuries, changed life in a myriad of ways. You know, um, we begin to see that thousands of new jobs begin to emerge across the 19th century, in particular into the 20th century. So we see a lot of people begin to be drawn into urban life for the first time. So they're leaving rural life on the farm and they're moving to big cities. We also see that business-oriented capitalism move to make the workplace, further and further from family life. So we're working long hours in a factory as opposed to working in our homes, et cetera, et cetera. But we also see that wage work tends to become more unpleasant. It's during this time that we see a lot of large scale use of child labor, things like that. But we also start to see social cues and causes that begin to champion workers' rights and things like that. So obviously it's during this period that we've got large scale use of child labor. Here we have several child coal miners. Children were used in all kinds of different industries, textiles, canning, all kinds of different stuff like that. But it's out of this that we also start to see, people advocating for these individuals, for workers' rights. So, we're not working 6 days a week for 12 hours a day. We're not getting locked into the factory, during our work day and all that kind of stuff. But similarly, we also see that in the beginnings of the 20th century, we see two of the most violent revolutions of the century taking place in places, or some of the most violent, revolutions taking place in places like Mexico, Russia, and in China in particular. So whereas the 19th century is categorized by like the American and French revolutions, the 20th century is really, kind of kicked off by these major revolutions elsewhere. So here we can see Vladimir Lenin initiating the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This goes on to create the first communist, country in the world. However, in China, we have Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen are massively influential in toppling the Qing dynasty, which overthrows 2,000 years of dynastic rule in China. So here we can see Chiang Kai-shek. He goes on to wage civil war against Mao Zedong and the communists, and later goes on to form the Republic of Taiwan, which is still in existence today. But we also have Sun Yat-sen over here. So Sun Yat-sen is more of the political side of this, whereas Chiang Kai-shek is more of the army or military side of this as well. But similarly, in Mexico, we have guys like Emilio Zapata and Pancho Villa, who are massively influential in the Mexican Revolution and helping to overthrow and corrupt dictatorships in Mexico and things like that. So we have Pancho Villa on the left and Emilio Zapata on the right there. But once again, we have a lot of major political revolutions going on during this time period and everything like that. But we also see that industrial systems created vast amounts of wealth and engendered a middle class, giving millions a new financial floor. So all these people who are moving to cities to get factory jobs, they're getting paid a wage for the first time. They're able to afford, luxury goods for the first time that they might not have otherwise been able to. So we start to see this emerging middle class coming about. But we also see that things like vaccines, as well as better public health, lead to longer lifespans and lower birth rates. So, with vaccines, we don't have to worry about half our kids dying from polio before the age of 10. And, therefore we also don't have to have 20 children with the expectation that half of them are going to die. And we also don't need all those kids to work on the farm anymore. So we see lower birth rates, but we also see, better health and everything like that coming about during this time as well. We also see that innovations begin to make business more efficient, which also begins to make them more profitable, which also helps create more, kind of financial flooring for a variety of people. So here we can see Henry Ford's assembly line. He's the first Western kind of entrepreneur to develop this, but it standardizes production and it makes it very cheap. Prior to this, an automobile would literally cost tens of thousands of dollars in, the 19th century, early 20th century, which would be in, in the millions by today's standards. And so they were really luxury items for the rich and elite. However, by streamlining the process, Henry Ford makes the Model T, cheap. And so every Model T only cost $400, which for that time was still a lot of money, but average people could actually afford it. And so once again, we see, average people are starting to afford luxury items for the first time. Now, it's during this time that we also see government functions expanding into new areas such as factory inspections, education, currency regulation, as well as product safety. So, in particular, factory inspections and things like that, we start to see, the end of child labor. There was a great book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, in which they went in undercover in the Chicago meatpacking industry and found out that, if somebody's finger got cut off on the line, it just got ground into hamburger, and who cares? So they're helping to create safety and health concerns. It's during this time that most children start to really go to public school, like wholeheartedly, and not just temporarily when they're not working on the farm and things like that. We also start to see that currency regulations. So we see a lot of money starts to shift away from gold standards, things like that. But we also see product safety and liability for companies being implemented and things like that. So in general, life is starting to get a lot better for a lot of people. However, the art of the 20th century was a product of revolutions in thinking and seeing. So it's really characterized by this very rapid kind of change. So that stylistic pluralism that we mentioned last time is going to start, going even more extreme. So it's very, very rapid. But we also see this very extreme diversity in style. So even if someone is working under the blanket term of like cubism, they might be doing something completely different than someone else. So just because we have these kind of overarching stylistic movements doesn't mean that everyone's going to be doing the exact same thing within it. So extreme diversity of elements, and that's largely due to this, kind of push for individualism as well as exploration or experimentation. Excuse me. So very, very prominent within this as well. So European artists in this exploration often look to ancient and non-Western cultures for inspiration. So instead of looking back to ancient Greece and Rome, which was very predominant from the 19th century back, we start to look at, the artwork of sub-Saharan Africa, of ancient Egypt, of, Asian or Polynesian cultures and things like that. And so in so doing, these artists begin to overturn the authority of the Renaissance, which had dominated art for the prevailing 500 years. So once again, we're starting to look at aesthetics beyond European aesthetic, if you will. So we're looking to non-traditional or traditional, ethnic aesthetics or tribal aesthetics, things along those lines. So, our first major movement of the 20th century is what's known as Fauvism. And like Impressionism, Fauvism is born out of a kind of critique. In French, Fauve literally means the wild beasts. And so once again, these artists kind of embraced that negative critique and just ran with it. But the Fauvists really expanded on the innovations of post-impressionism. So we can think of Fauvism as being kind of post-impressionism taken to its most logical extreme and its most individualistic kind of sense. So here we can see Henri Matisse. Matisse will later go on to be influential in a variety of other subjects, such as Dadaism, Surrealism, all kinds of things like that. But he has his beginnings in, academic art, begins to embrace post-impressionism and Fauvism. But we can really see that it's the exaggerated, unnatural use of color, which is really what Fauvism really embraces. But Fauvism also embraces this kind of allegorical type of image as well. So here we can see Henri Matisse's Le Bon de Vivre, or The Joy of Life. And so we have this kind of pastoral scene again. This is something that's echoed a lot in like traditional academic art. So this kind of time out of time, it's time out of place, if you will. So, we see all these people kind of enjoying themselves and being at one with nature, in harmony, and all of this kind of stuff. So we see, an individual playing pan flutes, ode to ancient Greco-Roman aesthetic. We see lovers, people lounging, all of this kind of idea. But once again, we see this very extreme exaggeration of color. We see this extreme divorcement from, traditional representational accuracy and realism. So it's embracing this kind of almost childlike quality, or at least the spontaneity of a child's drawing, if you will. But once again, all of this is meant to echo this idea of, personal inner expression and erudition and things like that. So it's not necessarily meant to be realistic or necessarily representational of something specific. It's meant to be representational of our own kind of inner thoughts about how life should be and all of this kind of stuff. Now, aside from Henri Matisse, we also have artists like Andre Derain, who also embrace Fauvism, and once again, everyone's going to be doing a little bit different stuff. So a lot of Matisse's work is much more allegorical and is representing scenes that don't necessarily exist, whereas Andre Derain is more literal in his representations. He's looking at landscapes, city scenes especially, such as we see here with London Bridge, but he's exaggerating it beyond our actual physical perception of reality. And so this is really taking that kind of post-impressionist extreme to its more logical extreme. But once again, we can see broken color, broken brushstroke, and everything like that being used to create a kind of essence or feeling of the scene, if you will, as other than a direct literal interpretation. But here we can see just another example of a Fauvist work, this time by George Braque. George Braque will later become one of the founding members of Cubism. So many of these artists work through many of these exact same styles as they come about. Fauvism is actually fairly short-lived. It's only lasts for about 5 or 6 years. Whoop, sorry about that. So here we can see once again another little bit more heavily tied to post-impressionism and the landscape, but really embracing that kind of exaggerated use of color again, wholeheartedly. Now, out of Fauvism, we also have a movement that's born known as Expressionism. And Expressionism is kind of a general term for art that emphasizes inner feelings and emotions over subjective depiction. Objective depiction. So instead of looking at, say, a scene and drawing it literally, we're going to be looking more at how we feel about a scene versus, say, how the scene looks. So Expressionism, once again, is a general term. There are still technically expressionist artists today. However, it evolves over time. But in the early days, Expressionism is really embraced in Germany. And so German Expressionism is really what kicks it all off. And this is a kind of, experiment in developing imagery that's characterized by vivid, often angular simplifications of a subject with dramatic color contrast and bold yet crude finish. So once again, we're not trying to be representationally accurate. We're actually trying to be kind of naive or childlike, but we're also trying to embrace outside aesthetics from non European traditions, but we're also trying to embrace that kind of vivid color coming out of post impressionism and things like that. So these techniques added this kind of emotional intensity to these kinds of works of art. So, artists are compelled to use expressionism to address the human condition, often exploring such themes as natural life, sorrow, passion, spirituality, as well as mysticism, as opposed to like religion or, still lifes and things like that. But they absorbed formal influences from not only medieval German art and non Western influences such as, Africa and Oceania, especially. So within German Expressionism, two major groups kind of develop, and the first would be Der Bruch, or the Bridge, and Der Blaureiter, or the Blue Rider. And so we're going to start with Die Bruch, or the Bridge, which is largely developed by this individual, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. And so here we can see one of his typical Die Bruch paintings. And so this is Street Berlin from 1913. And so this is prior to World War One. At this time, Berlin, Germany was a very metropolitan area. It was kind of seen as one of those like, Paris or Tokyo or New York type places where, people would go to, enjoy high fashion and high culture and, music and, all kinds of stuff like that. So a lot of Kirchner's, Die Bruch work at this time especially is focused on urban life within the city of Berlin and everything like that. So we see, kind of prominent individuals walking down the street, window shopping. We see them in their finery, the women in their like fur coats, men in their top hats and everything like that. But we can see these major stylistic influences coming from medieval Gothic German aesthetic, in that we have this simplification and this kind of abstraction away from recognizable reality so as to not be in competition with, natural reality and things like that. But we also see this aesthetic coming out of, oceanic and African masks, especially in how the features of the human face are represented. So we see this kind of general elongation and exaggeration of the form, especially within the facial features, which are very indicative of those African and, Polynesian masks and depictions of the human form, etc., etc. So very, very common kind of depiction there. But we also see that, Kirchner does a wide variety of these kinds of, scenes of everyday life. This one a little bit more focused on common people versus, say, upper class society. But we see, once again, that kind of exaggerated use of color. This one's actually kind of bridging in between Fauvism and Die Bruch, so they're kind of overlapping a little bit. But once again, just looking at average everyday life, exaggerating it into this, realm of non-representationalism, or at least non-objectivism, if you will. So even though it's representational of a subject, it's not realistically representational of that subject and things like that. But we also have artists such as Carl Schmidt Rudolph, and here we see dike overflow. So, we have like the big earthen, kind of mound holding back the water in like the Netherlands and overflowing. But we see this very kind of abstracted view of a landscape. Once again, exaggerated colors. It's meant to echo, this kind of late time and day where, we have that kind of red reflection across, the sky as dusk comes on and everything like that. So once again, it's this kind of, logical extreme building out of, Fauvism, but embracing a more emotional quality, but also embracing a non-traditional kind of aesthetic as well. Now, aside from Der Bruch, we also have Der Blaureiter, or the Blue Rider. And this is led largely by the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky, who lived in Munich between 1908 and 1914. So here we can see Vasily Kandinsky, and he'll later go on to really embrace, pure, non-objective abstraction as his career goes forward. But early on, we can see his early their Ballad Rider works are still somewhat representational or recognizable. So in this sense, we have a couple people riding horses through this kind of landscape with a blue mountain in the background, the title "The Blue Mountain." But once again, we start to see that it's taking on a more abstract quality and an exaggerated quality, which is meant to echo this idea of the artist's own inner feelings about this given scene that he's witnessing. And so we see it being represented in a more personally symbolic kind of way, as opposed to a naturalistically representational kind of way. So we see, his use of color is meant to, highlight or echo that idea of his inner, kind of emotional state within this kind of tranquil scene. So we have this very kind of somber scene. We can tell it's probably set in the fall, the foliage on the leaves and everything. We also have this kind of sunset behind the mountain there and everything like that. But other artists are dealing with their Ballad Rider in a many different ways. The other most prominent artist in this movement is this individual, Franz Marc, who does a lot of these kind of blue horse paintings. But he's embracing, this kind of interesting aspect of making a representational image out of non-representational mark making. So we have these very abstract, like kind of geometric or, linear kind of forms, which all combine together to create the illusion of these horse-like, images and everything like that. So once again, it kind of embraces a variety of different things, and everyone's doing their own kind of individualistic thing with this. But it's works like this which will also go on to influence aspects of Cubism and other things like that as well. And so here we see just another example. This is perhaps even more indicative of what will later become aspects of Cubism. But here we see Lionel Fininger, Bin's 4, and so, or I'm sorry, Bin 6. But once again, embracing this kind of personal style. We're looking at a subject from a variety of vantages and everything like that, and trying to create a more emotional kind of painting or emotional kind of view of a scene than a straightforward representational view. Now, by 1910, Kandinsky overturned one of the most important, roles of Western art. So he makes the shift to total non-representational imagery in order to concentrate on the expressive potential of pure form, freed from the need of being depicting anything or the need to depict anything. So after Kandinsky, art need no longer depict anything in particular. We don't need to paint a picture of something. We can just paint, and that will be the art. So in so doing this, Kandinsky hoped to create art in response to inner necessity rather than what we see in a kind of response to a need. So once again, he totally gets rid of representational imagery. Now we don't need to do a painting that is of something. It can just be of paint, and we can still recognize it for its individual qualities, its aesthetic qualities, its beauty, all of these kinds of things, if you will. And so here we can see one of his early completely non-representational paintings, and this is Composition 4. And so he begins to name or title most of his works in a way reminiscent of music. And if we remember, music is the most purely abstract art form, and that it does not elicit visual imagery within us. Instead, it elicits emotional responses and things like that. Now we could take, looking at this, we could pick out a few objects or elements within it that seem somewhat reminiscent of recognizable reality. However, they're distorted in such a way as to be almost completely abstract. We can also see that Kandinsky is also really heavily looking at guys like Cezanne in the way that he's applying color, this kind of blocky layout of color, if you will. He's also influenced by Fauvism in that once again he's using this very kind of exaggerated unnatural palette or color palette if you will. And so once again, we need no longer have to create a painting that is referencing anything. We can just let the paint be paint, and we can enjoy the paint for the aesthetic beauty that it creates in relationship to, you know, the color, the line work, the composition, etc., etc., etc. Now, that brings us to Cubism. And so, Cubism is originated by both Pablo Picasso and George Braque. So, we see Pablo Picasso on the left and George Braque on the right. And they both come to Cubism kind of independent of one another, but then they begin to start working together on it and then ultimately kind of go their separate ways again. So, some of the early works, especially, can be a little hard to distinguish between one another. And we'll see some of that as well here in a minute. But here we can see what's widely believed to be Pablo Picasso's very first Cubist work. And it's important to note that Pablo Picasso went through the academic system in his youth in the late 19th century. He could draw very realistically if he wanted to. He just chose not to, and he chose to embrace these more avant-garde movements as opposed to this very stale kind of academic artwork that he had been kind of brought up with. But here we can see this is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or the Damsels of Avignon. And once again, these are meant to be prostitutes. And so kind of a controversial painting, because once again we see a kind of lineup of 5 women in the nude. However, they are very heavily exaggerated beyond recognizable reality. So they are still representational, and this is a representational image in that we know that it's meant to be depicting multiple women. However, it's abstract beyond recognizable reality, in that he's starting to embrace these non-Western traditions and aesthetics. In particular, that kind of aesthetic of African masks, which we can see very prominently featured in these 2 individuals, but also in the rest. We have that kind of elongation and exaggeration of the human features, in particular the nose and the eyes. But we can also see that in the bodies of these individuals that he's also looking heavily at Polynesian carving aesthetic as well. If we remember our, discussion of, like Polynesian carving, a lot of the figures have this kind of oval, form to them. And so all of these figures had that same kind of oval-like form within their bodies. And so once again, it's embracing these non-traditional, non-European aesthetics for its major influence, but we're still representing something that's at least recognizable. Now, if we compare this to, say, this is the Houses at La Stec by George Braque, we can see this is the painting that actually gives Cubism its name, because we have these very cubilinear kinds of forms. And so George Braque's worked much more simple, much more heavily focused on, or at least influenced by guys like Cezanne and works like this. But once again, it's very simple, and it's, kind of breaking a space down into recognizable shapes. And so even though this is meant to be, a series like a small village and whatnot, it almost becomes more about the undulation of forms than anything else. Because we could read this as just, a variety of shapes that are interacting against one another, as opposed to being a recognizable image of a house and whatnot. So especially if we change the orientation of this painting, it could dramatically change how we read this painting. But between 1910 and 1911, Braque and Picasso began working together in what they call analytical cubism. And so analytical cubism sought to analyze subjects from various angles, then painted abstract geometric references to themselves. So in analytical cubism, we're trying to basically create a single image which shows all aspects of the given subject matter. So imagine if you're, trying to paint a portrait of me sitting here in front of you, but you're also trying to depict me in profile, from front on, from 3/4, from behind, all at the same time. So we're trying to show all aspects of a subject at once in one image. But it's at this time that Picasso and Braque's, work becomes very hard to distinguish. So a lot of it, they're working side by side, they're using the same color palettes, they're doing a lot of the same things. But here we can see a work that's very typical of this period of analytical cubism. And this one is The Portuguese by George Braque. And it might be, hard to see in this particular image or on the screen, but if we're looking at this, this is actually meant to represent a Portuguese man playing guitar. And so if we look, we can see his head up here, so we can kind of see references to eyes, his nose, a mustache. But if we look down here, we can see a reference to the guitar. So we can see the sound hole, the strings kind of overlaying it, the neck of the guitar, etc., etc. But once again, it's meant to try to represent all different aspects or viewpoints of this subject at one time. But we can also see that it's being used, or at least being created out of very simple color palette of like brown, black, and white. It's also done on kind of banal canvas. But once again, it's embracing that kind of impasto like brushstroke coming out of Fauvism and Impressionism and everything like that to create a kind of texture within the paint as well. But if we look at this compared to, say, Pablo Picasso's The Poet here, we can see how hard it is to distinguish Picasso and Braque's work early on. Especially early on, many of them aren't signed, so it can be very difficult to really distinguish between the two. But once again, they're doing a lot of the same aspects. I do feel like Picasso, or at least Picasso's version of this, it usually tends to be more extreme, more undulations in the forms, more geometric, whereas, George Braque's tends to be a little bit more on the simple side, such as we see here. But once again, we're trying to, view a subject from all different sides in this. Now, aside from aesthetic or analytical cubism, we also have synthetic cubism. So from 1912 onward, Picasso and Braque began to modify analytical cubism with things like color, texture, and pattern, as well as with collage or cutout shapes. And so painting in this sense becomes multimedia collage work for the very first time as well. But once again, it can be very hard to distinguish between their work at this time as well. So here we can see Pablo Picasso's, or at least example of synthetic cubism. So here we see bowl with fruit, violin, and wine glass. So we can see, this is embracing not only painting, but also charcoal drawing, as well as cut paper collage, and all kinds of things like that. So we can see that the major aspects of like the white and the black, that's actually all painted. But we have, newspaper with charcoal drawing over the top of it, kind of collaged in. We even see color paper collage, so we can see that kind of violin in the blue there, also referenced by its handle up top. But we can also see, lithographic imagery taken from books and things, such as the pears up here, which are, cut out and then collaged into this as well. So it's, once again, looking at the same ideas as analytical cubism, and that we're trying to represent a subject from a variety of vantage points at one time. However, we're bringing new, kind of elements into it. So it's not just painting, it's actually multimedia-ism at this point as well. But once again, here we can see just another example. This is Fruit Dish by George Braque. So once again, embracing synthetic cubism. In this sense, he's using paint and charcoal, and he's also layered up cardboard in this as well. So all these little brown elements that you see is actually cardboard that's been drawn on and everything like that. So once again, embracing non-traditional techniques and all of these kinds of things. But once again, a lot of these synthetic cubist style works are dealing with still lifes and things like that. But once again, from here, George Braque and Picasso begin to diverge. George Braque pretty much works with synthetic cubism for the rest of his life, whereas Picasso kind of embraces expressionism into it and kind of goes a little bit back to the analytical style, but begins to change it with aspects of expressive color and all kinds of things like that. Now, out of this, we also have a kind of style that begins to embrace cubism in different ways, and that is futurism. And Futurism is influenced by Cubism, but used for different ends, okay? So it has a lot of the same ideas, a lot of the same attributes, but we're going to try to do them in a different way. So it added a sense of speed and motion and a celebration of the machine to Cubism's fractured vantage point. So it's really embracing, like modern technology of its time, this kind of more fast-paced lifestyle that's beginning to emerge, and things like that, and trying to represent those kinds of things within the confines of this Cubist aesthetic, if you will. By multiplying the image of a moving object, futurists begin to expand the Cubist concept of simultaneity of vision as well as metamorphosis. So, when we're looking at the analytical Cubist works, we're trying to once again view a subject from like straight on, from the side, from behind, all at the same time. Well, in this, we're trying to embrace that in this kind of almost film-like aspect of, we're trying to capture that simultaneity of vision at once, so that we're seeing movement in a still image, if you will. And so that's the kind of major aspect of this. So Futurism really begins to translate the speed of modern life into works that capture this kind of dynamic energy of this new century, if you will. So if we look here we can see Giacomo Balla's abstract speed, the car has passed. And so what we see here is a landscape with a road cutting through, but what we're meant to be representing here is that idea of the wind gust as something speeds past you. So I'm sure you've all, been, walking along and you feel the wind coming off of a car as it drives really fast by you. Well, that's what he's trying to capture. But once again, this isn't something that we can necessarily see. You can't see that wind, in most cases, or you can't feel that gust, or you can feel it, but you can't see it, etc., etc. So how do we represent that in a two-dimensional representational artwork? Well, it's very hard. So here's where Cubism comes into play, because we can take that fractured vantage point of looking at multiple things from multiple angles, and we can kind of create the idea of that non objective or fleeting moment as it passes us by. Now here we can see just another example by Giacomo Balla. This is the speeding car. But once again, it echoes that idea of like that, simultaneity of vision, and that, our perception of movement is captured in film and things by, still shots in rapid succession, but playing those back at speed allows us the, illusion of movement within the film and everything. So in this sense, we're also trying to capture in a two-dimensional, kind of image, the act of movement without trying to recreate the actual movement itself. So in that sense, how do you get that, or how do you capture that idea of the car that goes by as a blur in your peripheral vision? Well, I think he does a pretty good job of echoing that idea of that, that kind of as it goes by. We only get this fleeting glimpse of it, and so therefore nothing in this seems really solid. It's more of that kind of undulation of movement coming off of it, if you will. The smoke or exhaust coming out, the dirt and whatnot kicked up, that kind of wind gust that you feel, all of these kinds of ideas. But similarly, futurists not only embrace this idea of movement, they also embrace this idea of like new technologies. So not only the car, but also, major kind of architectural aesthetics and things like that. Here we can see Joseph Stella, an American futurist. This is his Brooklyn Bridge, but once again, it's an aspect of that kind of mass movement of, communications, of, technology, industrial technology, all of these kinds of things being present in this as well. Now, from there, that brings us to an interesting figure, and we're going to end off on this lecture for today with this guy. But this is Marcel Duchamp, and he's very influential in a variety of different, styles. He does a little bit of Fauvism, he does Cubism, he does Futurism, but we'll really get into him more wholeheartedly next time when we talk about Dadaism. But in this sense, Marcel Duchamp also embraced futurism quite a bit. I believe we saw this image a little earlier on, but this is his Nude Descending a Staircase. And this is also a painting that was very heavily criticized when it was first made. It was often referred to as the shingle factory that exploded because it looks like a bunch of wood shingles from a house. But once again, I think it does a nice job of capturing a human in motion, because how do you represent in a still image somebody walking down the stairs and get the idea of them moving down the stairs and not just standing in the middle of the staircase. So I think he's done that quite well, in that these undulating forms, which are meant to represent that fractured vantage point, also begin to imply the kind of movement of the figure from the top left to the bottom right here as it descends that staircase. And so once again, this is a much more complicated version, much more interesting version, in my opinion, of futurism and analytical cubism, if you will, but kind of combined together. But once again, we'll see more of Duchamp's work a little, next time when we get into Dadaism. So that's going to end us off for this lecture, and we'll see you again next time.